Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to our second class of A God You Can Believe In, your personal approach to the divine. This is part of our annual February spirituality series sponsored by Temple Sinai's Adult Education Committee. It's so great to be with you all. Now, who is joining us, who was not able to join us last week for our first class on February 3rd? Was somebody not able? Oh, Susie. Well, welcome, Susie. And Randy, welcome to Susie and Randy. We'll get you some handouts that we shared. Or actually, do you have the handouts you've got the handout? Oh, okay. All right. Well, I'll share those with you, Susie. And I'm going to be sharing a number of handouts tonight. I'm going to put it in the chat box. So hopefully you can open up and download those PDFs. If not, email me, let me know, and I'll make sure you get the handouts. I'm also going to share my screen so you can see it on my screen as well. So our game plan for these 3 evenings together in February is fourfold, at least fourfold. It is to mainly to explore our faith, to discover a variety of different Jewish approaches to the divine, at least that I shared with you 9 of them. We may not discuss in depth all 9, but we may reference all 9. We're going to focus on at least 5. And we're also going to, in our time together, reflect on our personal relationship with God, and look at how we experience the divine in our lives and in the world. And I'm using the word God very broadly. And I'm hoping for folks who traditional Jewish God concept doesn't resonate with you, one of these other God concepts might. And that is my hope and my wish, because my understanding of the divine is very broad and very deep and very open to interpretation. And that's how I view the Jewish approach to God. And hopefully together we'll develop our spirituality. We'll deepen our spirituality together, deepen our connection with aspects of life that's larger than ourselves, aspects that help give our lives meaning and purpose, and aspects that provide us with a deeper level of engagement with life itself. And to me, that's also very sacred, whether or not you use the word God while you're doing those things, deepening your connections with life and finding meaning and purpose. To me, that's a godly pursuit. That's a divine pursuit. And other people might say, well, I don't call that God, and that's fine too, as we were saying. The only 2 rules that that I like to play by when talking about God and discussing God is that there is more than one God concept in Judaism. And there is a wide variety of Jewish God concepts that we can look at and explore and adopt for ourselves. And then there are some God concepts that are outside the bonds of Judaism, and that's okay too. That's why there are other religions. So with that sort of as our framework, tonight what I thought we'd look at is we would discuss traditional theism found in the Bible and the Talmud. That's our jumping off place. And I think a lot of us, when we think in terms of God and what is the Jewish idea of God, we think of those stories in the Bible and in the Talmud and in the Midrash, and that may be where we get a lot of our ideas from. And there are wonderful ideas in there. And I think when we start looking at what might consider to be more radical Jewish God concepts, we're going to see that those are not those concepts found in the Bible or in the Talmud, and that's what makes them radical. But they're also very much a part of Judaism. So we're going to look at traditional theism found in the Bible and the Talmud. We'll look at that tonight. We're going to look at something called religious naturalism, which is very interesting God concept that a lot of Jewish people have adopted, and it resonates with them. And then we're going to look at an offshoot of religious naturalism called predicate theology, that's very much in religious naturalism, but it was really explicated and drawn out and really explained and expounded upon by Rabbi Harold Schulweis of blessed memory, who was the rabbi in Encino, California for many years. So we're going to look at those 3 concepts tonight. Next week, we are going to look at, just to give you a taste, we're going to look at Martin Buber's I, Thou, I, You, theology, and we're also going to look at Abraham Joshua Heschel's, sometimes called depth theology. And we'll look at some others as well, but those are the sort of the five that I want to focus on, as well as our own personal beliefs. So want to allow for a lot of opportunity for discussion, for questions. So keep your chat box open and let's share with each other. So speaking of sharing, let me try to share this with you, and hopefully you get this. Let us start with traditional theism. And so I just shared it in the chat box. Hopefully you see that in your chat box. Hopefully you can click on that and it will magically appear on your computer screen. If not, let me know. I will email it to you later this week or early next week, but I'll also share my screen so you can see, we all can see what we're looking at. So hopefully you all can click on the traditional theism handout. And like I say, if you're not able to open it up, just text in the chat box and list your email, and I will I'll get that to you. So let me share my screen for that one. This is where it all begins. It begins with Torah, it begins with Bible, it begins with the rabbinic conceptions in the Talmud that are based on the Torah and the Bible, and the rabbis added to it over centuries. Okay. All right. Can everybody see my screen okay?
Okay.
Okay. Hopefully you can see it big enough. Now that this is the handout that I shared with everybody last week by Sarah Hurwitz, and I think Jason also shared it with us this week as a reminder about tonight. So this has 9 God concepts in Judaism, all kosher, all number of Jews who believe in it and who it resonates with them, it lands well with them. So we're starting at the beginning, and the sort of idea that God is all powerful, all knowing, and all good, more or less, according to Sarah Hurwitz. I like that, more or less. So here's what the more or less is. The more or less is hopefully what you are able to open up. And I'm just going to extend my screen a little bit here, extend my window if I can. So here are the biblical and rabbinical views of God as found in the Torah, the Bible, and the Talmud. God, of course, is the creator of the universe. Opening line of the Torah, of the book of Genesis. God is the creator of the universe. God reveals and redeems, right? God revealed God's will, God's wishes and desires for how we live our lives at Mount Sinai, in the Torah, in the 10 Commandments. And God, before that happened, God redeemed the Jewish people from Egyptian slavery. So these are classic ideas in Torah and in Talmud. God creates, God redeems, God reveals. And then adding some, sort of Greek philosophy from, and then Jewish philosophers who were influenced by Greek philosophy, like Philo of Alexandria, like Maimonides. They then took that idea of what's considered to be classical theism by philosophers, that God is all knowing, all powerful, all good, right? So God knows what's going to happen. God knows our thoughts, our feelings, our actions. God is aware of all that. God is all powerful. You might recall when Sarah in the Bible, the angels came and said, next time this year, Sarah, you're going to have a child. She was 90 years old, and Sarah laughs. And the angel says, why do you laugh? Is anything too difficult for God? Right? God is all powerful. God can split the sea and send 10 plagues to Egypt to free the Israelites. God can make the sun stand still in the book of Joshua for hours and hours. So clearly, God in Judaism, God is all knowing, God is all powerful, and God is all good. God is benevolent. God is not evil in Judaism. There are some traditions that have one God is good and one God is evil. And Judaism, during various times in history, had to speak out against it and said, no, there are not two gods, one good and one evil. God creates everything. Now, we're going to have to deal with that. If God is all good, then how do you explain evil in the world? And that is a problem for this traditional belief that God is all knowing, all powerful, and all good. How do you explain evil? And we're going to talk about that. God, this is one of my favorite ones, number 4. God is a personal God, meaning God has personhood. God has personality. God is a separate being who has a mind, who feels. The Torah and the Bible is filled with God's emotions. God gets angry at people. God is joyful when people do the right thing. God is hurt. God is saddened. God yearns. God hopes. God wishes. God has all the emotions that human beings have in the Bible. And I talked about Rabbi Neil Gilman of blessed memory in the first class and how he has really informed the way that I teach theology, and he was a teacher of Jewish philosophy and theology for decades at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York City, the conservative seminary. And I love, in one of Professor Gilman's lectures, he says what he most resonates with in Judaism is God's uh, palette of emotions, that God is so accessible, that God feels, God gets angry, God loves, God cares, God's compassionate. God is very human-like, or we are very godlike, depending on how you want to look at it. And for Professor Gilman, that's what's so fascinating about Bible and Talmud, this picture of God as being so human-like. And again, as we start talking about Abraham, Joshua, Heschel, we're going to see that for Heschel, that was also essential in thinking about God, that Heschel talked about the divine pathos, divine feeling, that God feels, God cares, God loves, God gets saddened and upset. The Talmud says that when couples divorce, the altar of God sheds tears. That's a way of saying that God sheds tears. That when there is conflict and strife between loved ones, that God sheds tears. A beautiful image. And I agree with Professor Gilman. It makes God very accessible, makes us able to relate to God. There is a book, and I'll show it to you. It is called God, a Biography by a Jesuit priest named Jack Miles. Has anybody read God, a Biography? I need to put up my chat so everybody, so I can see if anybody put that in the chat. Let me just extend this out. In this book, Professor Miles, can't see it yet. Okay, I'll bring up that chat one way or another. Let's see, here we go. Chat. Now it's behind one of my windows. Okay, all right, it's floating around my screen somewhere. Can you see that, by the way? Can you see my chat box? No. All right, so it's what I'm sharing is behind the chat box. So anyway, God, a Biography by Jack Miles won the Pulitzer Prize. He spends 400 pages sharing God's personality from all 39 books of the Bible. And God is the main character in the Jewish Bible. God is the most developed character in the Jewish Bible. And so his book really explores the personhood of God, and it is essential to the biblical mind and to the rabbinic mind. Now we're going to see when we get to Mordecai Kaplan, he disagrees completely. God rewards and punishes. God rewards and punishes, the fifth thing of a traditional theistic God concept. When we do the right thing, it says in the Torah, we're going to be rewarded with prosperity, physical prosperity. When we do evil, we're going to be punished. Reward and punishment is essential to the biblical and the rabbinic mindset. God transcends nature while also is immanent in nature, meaning that God is beyond the natural world. God is beyond the universe, but God is also found in the universe. I once read, I wish I could remember where I read it, but the idea is that the Jewish star depicts God's transcendence and God's eminence. Two triangles. One triangle is pointing up, like transcendence. The other triangle is pointing down, like God's immanence in the world. It's a beautiful way of understanding a Jewish star. It's representing this idea that God both transcends this world, this universe. God is above and beyond this universe, but God is also very much a part, active, to be found in this universe. Very traditional Jewish concept. God has a special relationship with Israel, of course. We have a covenant with God. We have a brit. So speaking of brit and Emily's grandson, Mark, that brit between God and the Jewish people is reflected in physical form in a boy at a bris ceremony, and for a girl at a brit ceremony, a baby naming ceremony for a girl. So classic Jewish beliefs. God is the source of ethical values. God is just, therefore we are just. God is compassionate, therefore we are compassionate. The list goes on, and we're going to look at this when we talk about Harold Schulweiss's predicate theology. He's going to turn that around in a very positive way. Evil. So the traditional concept of evil is we can't understand why righteous people suffer. If God rewards and punishes, and good people, it appears to be that they're suffering. It's not that they're being punished. We just don't understand why they're suffering. Traditional idea. Punishment may be, evil or suffering may be the result of sin. It may be a test, like Abraham was tested with Isaac, or it's just beyond our understanding. We do not know the ways of God. Because God is transcendent, we can't know everything there is to know about God. Therefore, we can't know all about why there's evil and suffering in the world. Now, for a lot of people, that is not acceptable, that we just can't understand it. It's like, well, if you can say everything else we can understand, why can't we understand this? So that is a stumbling block for a number of folks. Now let me share with you all, and again, I just want to walk through this and then we'll spend a few moments talking about it. Let me share with you all a beautiful way of understanding the value of these traditional Jewish concepts about God. And this is expressed by somebody who doesn't believe any of it. And his name is Mitchell Silver. He wrote a book called A Plausible God, Secular Reflections on Liberal Jewish Theology. So his book is really about the theology of Mordecai Kaplan, which we're going to look at tonight, the theology of Art Green, which is more of God as immanent, not, more of an immanent presence, and the theology of, I always blank on the third one. There's a reason that things are in threes. Threes are easy to remember. Oh, Michael Lerner, the publisher of Tikkun Magazine. If you like Tikkun Magazine, Michael Lerner, he's written a number of books, a student of Heschel, and a great thinker. So anyway, Mitchell Silver is rejecting those 9 biblical and rabbinical views, but he recognizes the functional value, the purpose of believing these things. And so here's what he's saying, what makes this so attractive to many people in the world, not just Jewish people, but many people in the world. Belief in the traditional God concept, says Professor Mitchell Silver. He's a professor, and I should say he's got a PhD in philosophy, and he's a lecturer at Tufts University and University of Massachusetts, Boston, and this wonderful book. I highly recommend this book to you. He spends a whole chapter talking about why these God concepts in the traditional view are so attractive. And here he sums it up in a couple of sentences. Belief in the traditional God concept is a potential workhorse. It aligns our beliefs and our practices with our community and with our traditions. This connects us to Jewish people for thousands of years, our ancestors. So it aligns our beliefs and practices with our community and our traditions. It gives us courage and hope for our endeavors. God, give me strength. This is a big reason why a lot of athletes are religious. They pray for success. I totally get it, by the way. If I wasn't religious, if I didn't believe in God, and I had to perform my job before 70,000 screaming fans, I'm going to get religion real quick, because that is pressure. If we think we have pressure, that is pressure. That field goal kicker who goes out there and he's got one shot to score, that is unbelievable stress and pressure. So I get why a lot of athletes are religious. It gives us courage and hope for our endeavors. God is with me. God's going to help me succeed. Doesn't explain why the other team's also praying for victory, and how does God decide who gets the victory that day? But psychologically, it makes perfect sense. God is a source of comfort and consolation for our losses. Absolutely. God gives us strength. God helps us be resilient when we suffer and when we lose things in life. Not for everybody, but for a number of people. And God is a protection and sanctuary from our worst fears. So if we are afraid, God is a source of protection for us. If you saw this part of the Star Wars movies, it was called Rogue One. And it wasn't officially with Luke Skywalker, but it was called Rogue One. And there was sort of a blind sensei who was a very wise person. I forget his name, but he, as he was about to go into battle that most likely he was going to not succeed at, he said, "The force is with me and I'm with the force. The force is with me and I'm with the force. The force is with me and I'm with the force." Substitute God for force. God is with me and I'm with God. God is with me and I'm with God. It helped him go into battle. Makes perfect sense. Belief in God gives us the language to speak of our most precious experiences, and a being to address when expressing existential emotions like gratitude. For those of us who feel a lot of gratitude, where does our gratitude go? For the Grand Canyon, or for a sunset, or for the birth of a child. We can thank the doctor for the birth of a child. Who do we thank for the sunset? Who do we thank for the Grand Canyon? Who do we thank for Hawaii? Who do we thank for the Verdugo Mountains? It is an address for our gratitude. Again, this is written by somebody who doesn't believe this, but he recognizes the functional value of such a belief. And I love how he articulates it so beautifully and clearly. It grounds our morality and gives us a perspective from which to understand the deepest questions. Back to God being the source of values. Why should we be compassionate when it might be easier to just exert our power and not care about somebody else's feelings? Well, if we don't feel that compassion by ourselves, we can be reminded that God would want us to do that. It grounds our morality and gives us perspective from which to understand the deepest questions. Why are we here? Why is there something rather than nothing in this world, in this universe? Why is there something? Why is there anything at all? That is an existential question that a belief in God answers. It's not the only answer, but it's an answer, and it's a powerful answer. So I love how Mitchell Silver says all of these beliefs and ideas, they have functional value in our lives. They're meeting a need that we have. And so let me stop the share, and let's allow for, a couple of minutes of questions or discussion about these traditional beliefs in Judaism, sometimes referred to as traditional theism. When we think of theism, the study of God, this is normally what people think of. but it's not all in Judaism. It's by no means all. So any questions, any thoughts, any comments about this? Don't be shy. Okay, pretty straightforward. Okay, I'm just curious, show of hands. And by the way, this won't show up on the recording. I think it just the person talking shows up on the recording. Show of hands. How many people find some of these beliefs attractive and they resonate with you? Show of hands. And you don't have to put your hand up if you don't believe it. I want us to be authentic and honest. Okay. So some of these ideas are attractive for a number of folks. That's why they've lasted for over 3,000 years. Now, for people who reject this, they might think that, well, it ends there. I either believe this or I don't. It's all or nothing. It's black and white. And in Judaism, it's not. It's not black and white by any means. Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan, who for over 50 years taught at Jewish Theological Seminary, taught hundreds of conservative rabbis. Mordechai Kaplan had a problem with most of these ideas and most of these beliefs. And therefore, he created a different approach to understanding God. And at the time, it got him excommunicated from certain Orthodox rabbis in New York City. But I will tell you what I'm about to present to you by Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan, who probably thought about God just about every day of his life, and who wrote about God in hundreds and hundreds of pages, not only what he published, but in his diaries, and you can find his diaries, thousands of pages, online at the Jewish Theological Seminary and some other websites that have his diaries online. He thought about God, he talked about God all the time, he prayed to God, he did all those things, but he didn't believe in a lot of this. And that's why I want to share with you Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan's beliefs, because when he came along in America, and he lived in America since about 1890 to 1983, he lived to be 102 years old. And he was incredibly prolific. And so the fact that he taught at the Jewish Theological Seminary for over 50 years, he influenced hundreds of rabbis, not just in conservative Judaism, but in Reform Judaism. He then founded another movement after he retired from Jewish Theological Seminary. He founded a fourth branch of Judaism called Reconstructionist Judaism. He influenced all those Reconstructionist rabbis, as well as Reform rabbis, as well as the thousands and the tens of thousands of congregants who all these rabbis taught and all the clergy taught. And therefore, Rabbi Harold Kushner, who wrote When Bad Things Happen to Good People, who was a disciple of Mordechai Kaplan, Rabbi Kushner could say, I think quite correctly, that Mordechai Kaplan is the most influential Jewish thinker in American Judaism. One could argue Heschel, but I think Kaplan's. I think Harold Kushner is correct. Mordechai Kaplan has had a greater influence, and I'm going to talk more about it on Friday night. It's not just his theology; it's what he created as far as Jewish institutions. And so anyway, I want to share with you now Mordechai Kaplan, what's called religious naturalism. So hopefully you were able to open up that handout about traditional theism. Now I'm going to share with you Mordechai Kaplan's religious naturalism, and I'm also going to share it on my screen so we can look at it. So back to the screen share. Can everybody see my screen okay? Oh, that's too big. Let me make it 75%. Can everybody see that okay? Yeah? Okay. So I'm going to give you some quotes and then we can talk about them and discuss. And I'm going to see if I can again bring up my chat box so it's floating somewhere in space on my screen. Okay. Who would like to read number 1? Can I get a volunteer? This is from his book, The Meaning of God in Modern Jewish Religion, 1937. He was talking about these things. Thank you, Seth.
We cannot conceive of God any more as a sort of invisible Superman displaying the same psychological traits as man, but on a greater scale. We cannot think of him as loving, pitying, rewarding, punishing.
Okay, thank you, Seth. So by the way, this is what Neil Gaiman said he loved about the Bible. And by the way, Neil Gaiman is a huge follower of Mordecai Kaplan. He was giving a lecture once and he said, his picture's on my desk. So go figure. And this is why I say in Judaism, your beliefs are your choice. And you might have a number of different beliefs about God, and that's okay. I think Neil Gaiman held many different beliefs, although if you were to ask him, he probably would say he was a religious naturalist. But he loved how God was depicted in the Bible in such human terms, but he saw them as metaphors. As the expression he used were word pictures. These are word pictures that we don't have to take literally, but they may have something to teach us. But for Mordecai Kaplan, he said God does not have personality the way God is portrayed in the Bible. We can't think of God as this all-powerful sort of Superman, like us, but better. All powerful, all knowing, all good, alive with emotions and mind and will and desire. We can't think of God that way. We're projecting ourselves onto God. By the way, Freud said that. Freud said our concept of God is we're projecting our own humanity onto God, and it's a neurosis, he said. And by the way, Freud didn't come up with that. We're going to look at a German philosopher named Ludwig Feuerbach. And Ludwig Feuerbach was the first one in the 1800s to say that we project onto God our human qualities. So we cannot think of God as loving, pitying, rewarding, punishing. That's a human being. God's not a human being. What is God? Well, let's find out according to Mordecai Kaplan what God is. So, and by the way, this is related to that. Seth, you want to read the next one? So if God doesn't have personality, if God's not a Superman in the sky, therefore we have to take something away. So Seth, what are we taking away?
We cannot, for example, believe God performs miracles and at the same time believe in the uniformities of natural law demanded by scientific theory.
Okay, so the splitting of the sea, according to Mordecai Kaplan, never happened. As a matter of fact, I was reading in a book by one of Kaplan's greatest disciples and scholars, named Mel Skolt, who was who is a professor. I think he may have retired. He's 80 years old now, but he may still be a professor at Brooklyn College. So Mel Skolt tells the story that he took his 13-year-old son to visit Mordecai Kaplan, his teacher, and Mel Skolt went through all his diaries, and he's the expert on the diaries of Mordecai Kaplan. And because he said, I told my son, that we can't take the miracles literally, the 10 plagues literally, and the splitting of the sea literally. And my son said, well, how did the Jews leave Egypt? How did they talk to Pharaoh? How was Pharaoh convinced to let the Jewish people go? And Mel Skolt tells the story that Kaplan said, what makes you think Moses spoke to Pharaoh? He never spoke to Pharaoh. They just left. It was a slave revolt. That's how the Jewish people left Egypt. They just walked out. Now, you can see why maybe Mordecai Kaplan was excommunicated by some Orthodox rabbis, because he clearly is saying you cannot take the Bible literally in certain places. It's metaphor. It's meant to teach us something. It has functional value. What is the function of the Passover story? The function of the Passover story, according to Mordecai Kaplan, and I'm sure we could figure it out too, is to teach us that freedom is to be valued in our lives. Freedom and liberation are values that we need to live by. That's the functional value of the Exodus story, whether or not you take it literally or figuratively. That is its value. I saw a hand up. Ben, let me stop the share for a sec.
Marilyn.
Oh, it was Marilyn. I'm sorry, Marilyn. I keep seeing a hand go up and assuming it's Beth.
Okay, my question is, how does Mordecai explain that they got through the Red Sea if God didn't part the waters?
He would say they didn't get through the Red Sea, or if they got through the Red Sea, they swam through it. He would say that that story did not happen the way it's written. I don't think he would even say, as some people have suggested, well, maybe it was natural causes. Maybe there was a strong wind, and it just so happened when the Israelites were crossing, there was a strong wind and it made the sea part. Mordecai Kaplan would say that's ridiculous. There's no wind that's going to make a sea split so that thousands of people can cross through, and then it's going to collapse on the Egyptians at the exact time that they need it. That's not the point. The point is that liberation and freedom is something that God wants for us in our lives. That is a universal human value that is portrayed in that story.
So
he would
does
say it never happened.
So does he believe that Jesus is the Son of God?
Absolutely not. If he does not believe that God is manifest in any personality, whether it is a human being or in, well, when I say God is not manifest, let me rephrase. He would say that Jesus is divine as much as anybody else on this earth is divine, that Jesus is not specially divine or is not God incarnate. If God is incarnate in every human being, and in yeah, I'll leave it there. I won't get to animals because I don't know what he thought about animals, but we can maybe extrapolate out based on a couple of other teachings we're going to look at of what he did believe about what is godly and what is divine. So I'm wondering, can we go on only because we're not going to get through everything? So let's keep some thought. Let's keep some questions in the chat box, and if we have time, maybe we'll get to them. So let's move on and let's talk about not what he doesn't believe about God, but what he does believe about God. Now, Carolyn, can I call on you because you voiced a belief about God last time that seemed very Kaplanian, very Kaplan-esque. So, Carolyn, would you be interested in continuing at this third, the only kind of religion?
Sure. The only kind of religion that can help him or her live and get the most out of life will be the one which will teach him or her to identify as divine or holy whatever in human nature or in the world about him or her enhances human life.
Thank you, Carolyn. So for Mordecai Kaplan, God is whatever in human nature or the world about us enhances human life. And that's leaded, and Carolyn, why don't you give us the next one and we'll unpack this a little bit more.
God is the power that makes for salvation.
That's a famous line by Mordecai Kaplan. His one-word definition of God, his elevator speech. If you were to ask him, who is God? What is God? the one sentence that Kaplan would say, God is the power that makes for salvation. Now, let's link that to the thing above it, the quote above it, and also, Carolyn, give us the quote underneath it, and I think we'll be able to put it together.
Self-fulfillment or self-realization is nothing more than the modern equivalent of what in general life is expressed by the term salvation, and in traditional Jewish life by the phrase having a share in the world to come.
Thank you, Carolyn. So let's unpack this even further. God is the power that makes for salvation. God does not have personality. God is not a distinct being. God is not individual, separate from us, transcendent from the world. God is only found in the world, and God is not a being in the world. God is a process. God is a power. God is a force. God is an energy. That's why I say Star Wars is Kaplanian. May the force be with you. Kaplan, he lived to see Star Wars. He died in 1980. I'd be curious to know if Mel Sculpt asked him, hey, what do you think about May the Force be with you? I'm sure he would have loved it, because that's what he believed. God is a force. God is a power. God is the energy. God is a process. God is not a being. God are all the things in this world that enhances life. Justice enhances our lives. Compassion enhances our lives. Love enhances our lives. Creativity, the ability for us to be creative and make a better world and do tikkun olam and be God's partners and be ethical and be righteous. All of that enhances human life. All of that is God, not as a being separate from us, but as a process working through us and working through the world. So when animals show compassion, which they do, I think Kaplan would say that's God working through that animal. That compassion is divineness, Godhead working, or God working through that animal. God is the power that makes for salvation. Salvation, not in a Christian sense, redeeming us from sin. Salvation in the sense of fulfillment. I'm going to give you a word, and I'm going to preview what I'm going to talk about this Friday at our Shabbat service. Salvation as shalom, as shlemut, wholeness, peace. When we talk about Shabbat Shalom, when we talk about a Messianic age, when we talk about Shabbat being a taste of the world to come, of the Messianic age, that is a state of the world that is filled with peace, no war, no hunger, no disease, no being frightened, no stress. That is what Kaplan is talking about. God is the force in the power in this world, the natural power, the natural energy that's going to get us to those states of fulfillment, perfection or perfectibility, self-fulfillment, being the best that we can be, creating our best self. That is what salvation is. God is the power that gets us there, naturally in this world. So let's, and I'll just give you one more and then let's discuss it. God is the sum of the, I'm sorry, do I still have the share? Yeah. God is the sum of the animating, organizing forces and relationships which are forever making a cosmos out of chaos. That is how Kaplan dealt with evil in the world. How do you understand evil in this world? Evil is those areas that are still chaotic, like cancer, like COVID-19, like natural disasters, the chaos of this world. God are the animating forces in this world that are forever making a cosmos out of that chaos. Those are areas yet untouched by God. And if a doctor, which they have, right, they've come up with a vaccine for COVID, that is God working through the doctors and through the scientists. That is the creativity that God has instilled in our hearts and minds to allow us to overcome the chaos of this world. And then I'll just give you one more and then we can talk about it. I could go on and on for Kaplan. You could spend a lifetime. That's what Mel Skult has done. He's spent the past 50 years just focused on Kaplan and Kaplan's thought. We could spend a lifetime. It matters very little how we conceive of God, as long as we so believe in God that belief in God makes a tremendous difference in our lives. That is the freedom to not be bound by the biblical understanding of God or the rabbinic understanding of God. It doesn't matter how we conceive of God, as long as we so believe in God that belief makes a tremendous difference in our lives. He was a pragmatist. He was utilitarian. He was influenced by pragmatic philosophers, utilitarian philosophers, and he read them very, very broadly and deeply. So let's spend a few moments talking about this radical. When he first said it was radical, it's not radical anymore. He said it in 1930. You know, it's how many years is that? Is that almost 90 years later?
90 years.
80 to 90 years later. But at the time, it was radical what he was saying, but influenced so many people. So, so some thoughts about that. What do you all think? Let me ask it this way. Has anybody heard this God concept before? Could you raise your hand if you're familiar somewhat with this God concept? All right. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 out of 18. I need to talk about it more. Okay, so we've got 5 out of 18. Can we do it again? I see the hands going up. Can we do it again? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 6. We're still only at a third. And if we were in a Reconstructionist synagogue, every hand would go up. But we're not a Reconstructionist synagogue, we're a Reform synagogue. However, a lot of Reform Jews, this resonates with them. I think they did a study, like Gallup did a study, or Pew did a study years ago, and they asked Jewish people, do you believe that God is personal, all powerful, all good, or do you believe God is a force, an energy in the universe? Most Jews resonated with an energy, a process, not the personal God of the Bible. Most Jews did, most Christians did not. It was a Jewish thing. It was Buddhist. I think Jews and Buddhists, even though Buddhists don't necessarily have a God concept, many don't, some do, but it was, you know, I think this is something that is attractive to folks who are like, I've never experienced that personal God that you find talking and you know, in the Bible. I haven't had that experience in my life, but I have experienced aspects of life, processes of life that have assisted me in my human fulfillment and in my growth. That I do know. That God I know. So yeah, Philip.
So my father was raised Orthodox in Germany, and we were raised Reformed here in Los Angeles. And in his later years, my father really, I think, took a liking or an affinity to Reconstructionist Judaism, and started going to lectures, and he became a member of an organization called the Society for Biblical Literature. And they used to have international conferences, and my dad would present papers, sometimes, I guess, maybe a little bit radical, at these international conferences. And he used to bring up things for discussion at Passover Seder, that we talked about a lot, that seemed very off the wall, like Moses wasn't Jewish and he was the illegitimate son of the Pharaoh's daughter. And So reading a lot of these stories that we've come to just accept as literature rather than theology. So I got a little taste of it in that way, but it was, I think for him, it was a lot of comfort in really wrestling with how he wanted to believe in God, and found it through Reconstructionist Judaism. And when I was in college, I took a class in philosophy of religion, and I don't remember a lot of it, but I do remember one quote that the professor said in sort of trying to figure out, what is God? And it was something to the effect of a being greater than which we cannot conceive. And I always interpreted that as every time you think you've sort of got this picture or image or concept of God, kick it up a notch, because you really it has to be more amorphous, I guess, than something that is concrete. And I don't know if it sounds a little bit like that might fit in with the Kaplan philosophy. I don't know who said it or how I would even research who said that, unless it was some other philosopher.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that, Philip. And I think, for people who have been exposed to some of these ideas, or, they're looking at archaeology or biblical scholarship or what's called biblical criticism, you find some of these ideas. And certainly I think what's fascinating about this too is, you find this in conservative seminary. You find this in Reform seminary. You find this in Reconstructionist seminary. And for people who studied with Kaplan, and they entered seminary and they hadn't studied with him before or heard it before, it just blew their minds that you could think of God in this way and still call it Jewish. If somebody were to say to Kaplan, there's a famous joke about Kaplan, God is dead and Mordecai Kaplan is his prophet. That's the joke. God is dead and Mordecai Kaplan is prophet. Kaplan would be horrified by that statement, because God was very much alive for Mordecai Kaplan. Like I say, probably spent every day of his 102 years thinking about God, or at least when he, was of an age where he can start to contemplate those things. So God was not dead. God was very much alive to Kaplan. And so people sometimes have this idea, it's the biblical concept and the rabbinic concept of God or atheism. And Kaplan came along and said, I know, if Judaism is going to survive for the contemporary mind, where we've got people with PhDs and studying science, and we've got to make Judaism relevant and resonate with learned people who know science, who know philosophy, who, when they read these stories, are going to say, that never happened. That's ridiculous. How could that have happened? I don't live in such a world where the sun stands still because God tells it to, or a sea splits because that's God's will, or Moses puts his staff in there and it splits. That's not a world I know. And Kaplan came along and said, well, let me show you how you can believe in God and be devout and be a committed Jew, but believe something that's going to be compatible with your understanding of the world. And his ideas are still relevant, and maybe they're more relevant today than they ever were, when there's been a return to fundamentalism, or there's been a return to literalism in certain quarters of America and in certain segments of the world. I think what Kaplan has to say is probably will be relevant for hundreds of years, if not more. So let's move on to, I want to share with you, he had many disciples, many students who he had a tremendous impact on their spiritual lives, and rabbis and their teaching and their rabbinate. And none perhaps more so, although I think a lot of people are in this boat, of Harold Schulweis, who was the rabbi in Oakland, California, first, again, studied at JTS with Kaplan, with Abraham Joshua Heschel, because Kaplan and Heschel both taught at the same time. By the way, Kaplan was influenced by Heschel. He once wrote a prayer. He wrote a prayer based on one of Heschel's essays. So there was a rivalry between the two of them because certainly Heschel didn't believe what Kaplan believed, but Kaplan resonated with a lot of what Heschel had to say. And so Harold Schulweis was a student of Heschel. He was a student of Kaplan, and his predicate theology has got Mordecai Kaplan's fingerprints and brain cells all over it. And so let me share that with you now. Well, let me start this way. Let me start this way. I am going to share something with you all. And this is, by the way, what I do with the 7th graders, because I want our B'nai Mitzvah students who may not resonate or think God doesn't exist. I want to give them something that I hope is going to land well with them and that maybe they can affirm. So let me go back to sharing this. And sharing this. And this is exactly what I put on the board when we're in person with our 7th graders, and I've been doing it for years when we talk about God. So I have 2 columns, column A and column B. By the way, I got this from Harold Schulweis. It's his teaching, and I just changed some of the examples. You've got column A, God is just, God is caring, God is compassionate, God feeds the hungry. These are traditional Jewish God concepts. This is all a part of rabbinic Judaism. This is all a part of biblical Judaism. God is just, God is caring, God is compassionate, God feeds the hungry. Now in column B, there's another way of saying it. God is just, or, and or, doing justice is godly. God is caring. Caring for other living beings is godly. God is compassionate. Being compassionate is godly. God feeds the hungry. Feeding the hungry is godly. So here's how Rabbi Schulweis taught it. Here's how his student and disciple, Rabbi Eddie Feinstein at Valley Beth Shalom, currently does it. Here's how I do it. Here's how I think a lot of people do it with the religious school students and with adults. I want you all to look at column A and look at column B. And I'd like to ask you, how many people can affirm and believe what's in column A? Show of hands. Who believes what's in column A? Okay, and again, there's no right or wrong answers here. It's what you authentically believe. Okay, who believes what's in column B? Look around our Zoom room. Is that everybody's hand? Think about that for a second. What has changed? What has changed is the predicate has become the subject. God is just. The word just has become the subject. Doing justice is godly. It's just flipped around. Caring is now the subject in B. Compassion is the subject in B. Feeding the hungry is the subject in B. These are all attributes of God and qualities of God in Judaism in A. They're all there in the Bible and the Talmud. And what Schulweis did, Rabbi Schulweis, is he said, I'm going to flip it based on the teachings of Mordecai Kaplan and what he thought about religious naturalism. And he coined the phrase predicate theology. Rabbi Schulweis did. Predicate theology, column B. Focus not on God the subject, who Maimonides said is unknowable. There's nothing we can say about God. God is totally unknowable. That was Maimonides based on Aristotle. And Maimonides said, all that we can say is what God is not. God does not have a body. God does not feel. That was Maimonides' approach. He was not, he had a different God concept than what's in the Bible and the Talmud. It was Aristotelian. You cannot say anything about God. All that you can say is what God is not. And what Schulweis did is he took that idea. You can't say anything about the subject, but you can talk about God's attributes. And that's also Maimonides. So Maimonides influenced Schulweis's predicate theology. Kaplan influenced the predicate theology. And by the way, the first person to come up with predicates, he didn't call it predicate theology, was that German philosopher, Christian, named Ludwig Feuerbach. If you look at his book, The Essence of Christianity, 132 times they did a word search. The word predicate comes up 132 times in Ludwig Feuerbach. Harold Schulweis studied Ludwig Feuerbach. He wrote his a dissertation, I believe, and I have a version of his dissertation, which is called Evil and the Morality of God, where he talks about, he first uses the term, well, it's not the first time he uses the term predicate theology. He wrote an article in the Reconstructionist periodical, and he talked about predicate theology in that. But this book has a whole chapter on predicate theology, and Schulweis talks about Ludwig Feuerbach. And so for Freud and Marx and other people, what Feuerbach was saying was the death of God and God's just a projection. Schulweis said, well, that's true. We do project these things onto God's a personal God, a personality, a being outside of us, but that doesn't mean those attributes are not divine. Feuerbach said those attributes were divine. So, but again, this is Kaplan-esque, this is Ludwig Feuerbach-esque. I know I'm throwing around a lot of names, so let's talk about it. Do you have questions about what Harold Schulweis is doing here with his predicate theology? Yes, Marilyn. That's Marilyn's hand.
Marilyn's hand. I think of column B, they're all mitzvah or mitzvot, plural.
Yes.
That's what my thinking of column B.
Well,
Every
you're
one of
right,
them-
Marilyn. They are all mitzvot, and that's why what you have in Judaism, that's why we really are a mitzvah-based religious practice and not necessarily a faith-based practice. There's a famous joke, I forget who says it. Maybe it was Eddie Feinstein in his book about Harold Schulweis. He wrote a book about Harold Schulweis, which is brilliant. It's called In Pursuit of Godliness. It was his PhD dissertation at JTS, and I recommend that book, In Pursuit of Godliness, by Rabbi Edward Feinstein, who's the rabbi over at Encino, a successor to Harold Schulweis and a disciple and a friend of Harold Schulweis. I think Eddie Feinstein tells the story that, the classic line, a rabbi and a Protestant minister, having lunch or having drinks, and when they part, the Protestant minister says, "Keep the faith," and the rabbi says, "Keep the commandments." And it's the Jewish way of saying, what's our focus? Our focus is on the mitzvot. That's how we're to live our lives. And that's why I say, and I will continue to say, belief in God is considered a mitzvah in Judaism by most, not all. There were some Jewish philosophers who said you cannot command belief, therefore it's not a mitzvah. But in traditional Judaism, the first commandment, I am the eternal your God who brought you out of Egypt to be your God. That's considered the first commandment, belief in God. So it's there, but there are 612 other mitzvot. So one can be a good Jew and not believe in God the same way one can be a good Jew and not keep kosher. So you're not doing all the mitzvot. I don't think you can be a good Jew and not keep any of the mitzvot. I don't think that works. I don't know what the number is. I don't know what the threshold is. But if belief in God is a mitzvah, it's one of 613. And there are plenty of Jews, committed Jews, who aren't keeping all 613. By the way, nobody can, because a lot of them have to do with animal sacrifices or living in the land of Israel, and we're not doing either of those here in America. So I think we can maybe keep a couple hundred mitzvot. Somebody once figured it out. I think it's like a couple hundred mitzvot can actually be kept in the 21st century. And I think the number even goes down if you don't live in Israel. So, because some of the mitzvot are specific to living in the land of Israel. So, yes, Carolyn.
I just wanted to say that these two columns are kind of, column B is sort of the basis of a 2-year curriculum called Partners with God and Living as Partners with God that we use in the 4th and 5th grade in our school, in which the first lesson is B'Tselem Elohim, about being in the image of God, and then the description of God and all the things you are supposed to do in order to demonstrate that you are an image of God is the whole basis of that curriculum.
Yeah, so yeah, that's wonderful, Carol. It's so great that you teach the kids that, and the kids are learning
I
that.
didn't realize I was teaching the Mordecai Kaplan.
Well, you're teaching Mordecai Kaplan, you're teaching Maimonides, because Maimonides believed that the path to God, we can't really know God, but we can emulate God, we can imitate God. That was Maimonides. So before Mordecai Kaplan was doing it, Maimonides was doing it, and the Jewish people were doing it. There's a great line that Harold Schulweis quotes in the Talmud, quoting Jeremiah, where the quote from Jeremiah is, let's see if I can get it right. I wasn't prepared to do it now, so I'm gonna try to just get it right. I've talked about it before when I talk about a Schulweis. So if I get it wrong tonight, I'll fix it, and modify it next week. But the quote from Jeremiah is, they've forsaken me. God is speaking, Jeremiah is speaking for God. They've forsaken me. They've forsaken my mitzvot. And the rabbis twist Jeremiah's words to say, would that they have forsaken me, but kept the mitzvot. Would they have forsaken me, but kept the mitzvot, because by keeping the mitzvot, it would bring them back to me. That's the rabbis of the Talmud or the Midrash. That's 1,500 years old. That's predicate theology. That's Mordecai Kaplan. That's Harold Schulweis in the rabbinic tradition. One person in the rabbinic tradition. Now, that's not to say that that person didn't think that God was a personal God and that God, had existence and wasn't just a force or process, but that mitzvot were paramount in Judaism. Mitzvot are paramount in Judaism. Belief is not as important. Belief in God is not as important as keeping the mitzvot. Keep the faith, keep the mitzvahs, keep the commandments. That's what Judaism focuses on. So anyway, Schulweis used to love that quote from Jeremiah. That's where I first learned the quote of the rabbis based on Jeremiah. Let me give you some more Schulweis quotes, because brilliant theologian and rabbi, and very much in the path of Mordecai Kaplan, and Buber. When we talk about Buber, Schulweis too was a follower of Martin Buber and Heschel. Let me see if I can get the right one for you here. I'm trying to put this in the chat box, and then I'll share the screen. Here we go. And now I'll share the screen. And I'd like to invite somebody to, well, let me do the first one. And then I'd like to invite some folks to do the second one. Let me make this a little bit larger. All right, so at the beginning, what I'm holding in my hand, Evil and the Morality of God. This is the second edition of Harold Schulweis's book, came out in 1984. I've got both. I've got the original edition at home on my bookshelf, and I've got the newer edition. Same words, just different printing. He begins his section in this book titled Toward a Predicate Theology. He begins it with the epigraph, with the quote from Ludwig Feuerbach. not the attribute of divinity, but the divinity of the attributes, is the first truly divine being. Not the attribute of divinity, not God, but the divinity of the attributes, caring, compassion, justice, feeding the hungry. That is the first truly divine being, according to Feuerbach, and Schulweis read that and just took off with it, along with the other teachings of Mordecai Kaplan. So if somebody would like to read another, we got two quotes from, I've listed two quotes from this book, Evil and the Morality of God. Who would like to do the critical question for predicate theology? Any takers? Let's see, Mike, and then Maggie, if you'll do the second one.
Okay. The critical question for predicate theology is not, do you believe that God is merciful, caring, peacemaking, but do you believe that doing mercy, caring, and making peace are godly?
Right. And just to know how much that Harold Schulweis was influenced by Feuerbach, if you get The Essence of Christianity, you can find it on Amazon. Feuerbach says something that I've heard Schulweis quote many a time and has absorbed as his own, that Schulweis said, and Feuerbach said it first, the true atheism is not disbelieving in God. The true atheism, said Feuerbach and Schulweis, is not believing in the attributes. That is atheism. Again, radical ideas, but part of Judaism. Now, thanks to folks like Mordecai Kaplan and Harold Schulweis. The critical question, what do you believe in? Do you believe in the attributes, or do you believe in the subject, God? Schulweis says it's the attributes. Okay, thank you, Mike. Maggie, if you want to do the next one.
What do the qualities which are said to manifest godliness have in common? They are united in their loyalty to the superordinate ideal of goodness. The attributes are internally related in their common aim to sustain and advance the quality of living, which is characterized as godly.
Okay, let me unpack that a little bit. And Schulweis, I just pulled that out of the book, and there's a whole context surrounding that. So the context is, with all these different attributes of God, compassion, caring, creative, loving, cooperative, feeding the hungry, all these attributes, how do you then do the Shema? Hear, O Israel, the eternal are God, the eternal is one. What is the oneness? What is the unity of God with all these different attributes? And Schulweis answers that question by saying the unity of God, what combines all these attributes together, is that they are all under the heading of goodness. These all are aspects of being good. And remember, one of the main qualities of God in the traditional concept is that God is all good. So here, all of these attributes lead back to goodness, and that's where you get the Shema and the unity of godliness, or God, according to Harold Schulweis. Is it promoting the good? And this is back to Kaplan. Remember, anything, the power that makes for salvation, you could substitute the power that makes for goodness. Kaplan would have been very happy with that substitution. So anything that we do, anything in this world that promotes goodness, that is godly. And that unites all these different attributes of godliness, which is the term that Harold Schulweis liked. He liked the term godliness, or Elohut. Elohim is God. He liked Elohut, godliness. He coined the term Elohut, godliness. And actually, he wrote a book, and let me just, if you can still see my share, let me go down. So here's what I'm taking from. I'm taking from something Harold Schulweis, I think was on NPR, or no, Krista Tippett. If you know Krista Tippett on Being, the MP, I think it's, it's broadcast on NPR, but it's a separate thing, On Being. Krista Tippett, I believe, was interviewing Harold Schulweis, and on NPR's website years ago, I found, this essay by Schulweis, and it said from his forthcoming book, Godliness, Translating God, unpublished, I said unpublished manuscript. So I had the pleasure and the honor of meeting Harold Schulweis many years ago when I was here in California, and I was sitting at the lunch table with him. And I said, I've read your philosophy, your theology. I found it very powerful, and it makes sense to me. And I teach it as well. And he made a joke about, oh, you mean they haven't fired you yet? Because he recognizes the radical nature of these ideas. And I said, hey, I saw on NPR in preparation for my class with the kids that you got a book that you're going to publish called Godliness. He said, yeah, it's on the back burner. I'm not able to finish it. And so anyway, I still have I saved to my hard drive. I've got the essay that he shared with NPR that talks about this book, Godliness, that he never published. Anyway, so godliness was the term that he used for Elohut. So let's talk a little bit more about this predicate theology. Does this resonate with some folks? I mean, a number of people, you put up your hands, so clearly it does. Has anybody, is this the first time you've thought of it that way? Focusing on the predicate, not on the subject? Susie, you want to share? Yeah, Susie, why don't you unmute and share?
Nothing really to share, but it honestly is the first time I thought of it that way. So I don't know, it's very interesting. It's speaking to me. I just have to wait until I can answer. But it's yeah, I like that idea.
Yeah, it's another way. And by the way, thank you for Susie. And I thought of, it made me think of something. Did somebody else though want to comment? I think I saw another hand, Maggie.
Yeah, I think the only thing that sort of is lost in it is the awesomeness.
Yeah.
Shall we say, the something that's so much greater than us, kind of, sort of thing. It doesn't seem to fit into that.
Okay, well, let's talk about that, because I do think transcendence is still a part of Mordecai Kaplan's theology, and it was still a part of Harold Schulweis's theology, in that we're talking about self-transcendence. This is not humanism. In humanism, the human being is the be-all to end-all. And that is the greatest power. What Mordecai Kaplan and what Schulweis, they were awestruck. They were awestruck by a sunset. They were awestruck by beautiful music. They were awestruck by a child, the birth of a child, all these things that in nature, all these things that we are awestruck by. They felt that deeply. And they saw those things outside of themselves as godly, as divine. Nature is still awesome. Human goodness of another person is still awesome. Schulweis marveled at the righteous Gentiles who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. He marveled at their courage. And why would they do that? They risked their own children's lives in many cases to shelter Jewish people. And he asked them, and he's created a foundation for righteous Gentiles so that he raised money for these righteous Gentiles. You can still contribute to Harold Schulweis as the foundation for righteous Gentiles. He wanted to raise money so that they would have food and clothing and a place to live, because many of them were destitute, or, for those who didn't have money, he wanted to make sure they were taken care of by the Jewish community. And he asked them, how did you do it? You risked your children's life, you risked your life. And often the response was, how could I not do it? I'm not a hero. Don't call me a hero. Don't call me courageous. How could I not do it? I would want somebody to do it for me. And he was dumbfounded by that response, the humility of that response, the everyday courage of that response. And so the sublime, the awesome, the transcendent, it's still there, but it's in nature.
Mhm.
And when we think about it, all we know is what's in nature. That's all we have experience of. And Schulweis and Kaplan were just saying, let's bring it to the level of our empiricism. Let's bring it to the level of our observation, like science. If you can sense it, if you can feel it, if it's part of the natural world, if you can observe it, if you can affirm it in your own experience, if it's good, we're calling it God. It transcends us. It's outside of us. So some people ask, or Schulweis, I should say, answer the question, well, why do you call that God? Why don't you just call it a feeling of awe? Why don't you call it a feeling of resonating with the beauty in the world? Why don't you call it ethics? Why don't you call it morality? Why are you calling this stuff God? And I thought Schulweis gave a pretty good response. He gave 3 reasons. And when I'm looking at the clock, so it's 8:29, so let's just spend a couple of minutes on this, and then I want to talk about next week. Schulweis writes, and he's got a title of a part of his chapter, Why Use the God Terms? The first reason that Schulweis gives is what we're talking about: justice, compassion, cooperation, self-sacrifice, altruism, all these attributes that we admire in other people and we'd admire in the world. We need to raise that to the level of reverence and worship. Otherwise, it's just ordinary, and it's not ordinary. What those folks did, those righteous Gentiles did, was not ordinary. Let's call it what it is. It's deserving of our reverence and perhaps our worship and our emulation and ultimate value in our lives. And so by calling it godly, we're putting it at the level it needs to be. That was one reason. The other reason that he said is it connects us to our ancestors. If our ancestors believed that God had personality and God was a separate being that if you could point to it, you could say, oh, that's God outside of us, as a being, as an entity with mind and personality, like we have a separate beingness and personhood. Schulweis and Kaplan would say, well, I don't believe that, but I believe what my ancestors believed when they said God is, that compassion is godly and justice is godly. I believe in the predicates. It connects me to my ancestors. It connects me to my parents and my grandparents and all the Jewish people came before me. So now we're still all talking the same language. We're just modifying a little bit. And Schulweis said there's value in that. It connects me to my Jewish text, the sacred texts, and my people. And I think that's a good answer too. Mm-hmm. The third answer that Schulweis gave, and perhaps maybe one of the most powerful, is he said, who is to say that the Bible or the Talmud has a monopoly on what God is? If we take the position that the Bible and the Talmud were written by human beings, we're human beings too. Who is to say that their ideas are superior to ours? Now, if you believe that God wrote the Torah and God inspired the Talmud, and everybody else, Moses and everybody on down, was just taking dictation from God, well, you can't say that. But if you believe that all of these sacred documents in Judaism were penned by human beings, then who is to say their God concept is better than ours and that they have a monopoly on it? I find that to be a very compelling argument as well. So all this is to say that me personally, I don't believe, Kaplan, and I believe in what Kaplan and Harold Schulweis, I believe in their theology, but not always. Not always. When my son was hit by a car and flipped in the air and broke his bone right at the hip, and the doctor, right before she wheeled him in at midnight that very night, and the doctor said to me, I just need to let you know, Evans, if the blood vessels in his hip area have been compromised, if the arteries have been damaged, he's going to have problems. I said, what type of problems? He said, well, may not, may have to have a couple hip replacements, may have to get an artificial hip, may be deformed. One leg may be taller than another. He may not run. I said, what do you mean he may not run? He runs track. Can he run track? Well, he may be able to run track. Well, he may be able to run, but he can't run track with an artificial hip. The God that I prayed to as he was in surgery that night at 1 o'clock at Children's Hospital when I was in the lobby, I was praying to a God who does heal and he can perform miracles and can make natural law, can bend natural law if possible, so that Evan would be able to walk and run and not be deformed. That's the God I was praying to. And that's the God I needed. There are other times where I don't pray to that God. And that's why I say we've got the freedom in Judaism to have different beliefs about God and in different times of the day and during different circumstances. As Neil Gaiman said, the God that I think of or portray or relate to at the birth of my grandchild is a very different God than the God that, I'm paraphrasing now, these aren't his words, but the God that I'm thinking about when I hear of a tragedy. I'm interacting with a different concept of God in those different moments. And we've got the freedom to do that in Judaism. Yeah, Ben. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I believe that all that you've discussed tonight is applicable to our God, and he's everything that represents God is almighty, good. Any adjectives that apply to God are certainly applicable. You take science, it's all fixed. Believe me, any science that's developed is fixed. God is universal. He's never ending. He's almighty, always good. But there's another category that confuses me. We also have the bad. And let's take the COVID virus and all of the other diseases that mankind has had to associate with one way or the other through the millennia. How do we think of that?
Yeah, how do we deal with the suffering in the world, the chaos, the, natural, for lack of a better word, evil. There's evil in the world. How do we deal with that? I think Harold Kushner, who was a disciple of Mordecai Kaplan, like Harold Schulweis was, I think Harold Schulweis, his book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, he gave some pretty good answers. He said one answer is the evil in the world, the natural disasters. And Maimonides said this too. We live in a world, the physical world is prone to decay. We live in an imperfect world. It's prone to decay and to disease and to bacteria and to virus. And that's just the world we live in. And so there is this natural evil, and it's just the nature of physical bodies to be affected by these natural things that cause suffering and pain and death. That's the physical world. We don't know of a physical world where those things don't exist. So that's one thing. That is the world itself. The other thing that Harold Kushner said is some people, we have free choice, right? And that's a very Jewish idea, a traditional Jewish idea. Everybody has a choice. If somebody wants to harm somebody else and they have the means in which to do it, mostly in our experience, there's not going to be an intervention like there was at the Red Sea. God's not going to step in and fix it. Bad people do bad things. Bad things exist in the world because there's decay and disease in the world built into it, and earthquakes and hurricanes and tsunamis and viruses and bacteria. That's the world we live in. And then Harold Kushner says sometimes it's just bad luck. We're just at the wrong place at the wrong time when misfortune comes. And those are some of the reasons why we experience evil. And Harold Kushner would say that idea that God's all powerful, nope. Can't have that. Can't have that and have an all good God, because we know there's evil in this world.
But
and we
Rabbi,
can't have both.
Rabbi, how does he explain this evil in certain people? Certain people are just mean, evil, bad. They can't be good. They can't be nice. How does he explain something like that?
Well, I think, they leave it to the psychologists to explain that is it nature? Is it something in the genes? Is it nurture? Is it something in the environment? Is it a combination of genes and environment for a sociopath or for, a psychopath who doesn't have a lot of compassion? Is it just part of their DNA? They didn't come into the world with a lot of that compassion in their brain cells, in their neurons? Or is it that in a combination of they were raised in a way that compassion was looked down upon and was not cultivated and was not a value in their family or in their lives? So I think they would say if it's in people, it's probably a combination of genes as well as environment and how the choices they're making. Now, Maimonides would say it's all about choice. Forget about genes. Everybody has a choice. Maimonides said anybody can be as righteous as Moses or as wicked as Jeroboam, a king in Israel. We have the choice. Nobody forces us to be wicked. We have a choice. And that's a classic Jewish answer of they just are making the wrong choices. And God's not going to stop it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. It's important. This is a whole, what I said last week, it's about, on one level, theology is about how do you deal with death. On another level, theology is about how do you account for evil in the world. And if your theology doesn't have a good answer to how to deal with why is there evil, it's got some work to do.
Thank goodness we have TSG.
Yeah.
Everything is good.
Well, thank you, Ben. And thank you all for being here. So next week, it's not Wednesday, it's next Tuesday at same time, 7 o'clock, Tuesday, February 16th. And please take a look in preparation for that. We're going to discuss more. I want you to dust off the, You know, that one handout that I gave you in the first class that talked about when you think of God, what do you think about? And when and where do you experience God's presence? So we're going to have a more in-depth discussion with that during our third and final class together. And then we're going to look at the theology of Heschel, the theology of Martin Buber. So in preparation for that third class, continue to look over, if you haven't read, Sarah Hurwitz's sort of 9 God concepts from her book Here All Along. Take a look at that if you haven't looked at it, or look at it again. Take a look at the handout. Maybe spend some time thinking about, when you think of God, what comes to your mind, what images, what ideas, what feelings, as well as when and where do you experience God's presence. And then also look at the handouts that I shared with you today in the chat box. And if you have any questions about, because we didn't get to all of Kaplan, if you have any questions about the handouts, we'll talk about that too. So I want to thank you all. I am going to stop the recording, and we'll look forward to seeing folks. We'll look forward to seeing you next week. And if you're not able to be with us next week, this is on YouTube. You can find it on Temple Sinai of Glendale's YouTube channel. And I'm going to stop the recording so we all have a